I've always been someone who tries to prove themselves in many different ways. I've tried to prove myself to people, to myself, to the public, to private matters. I've tried to prove myself many times. And by this point in my journey, I've become exhausted by it. I've become extremely tired of proving myself. And I think many of us in our lives are. The constant disappointment, the constant perfectionism that puts a standard on ourselves that we could never hope to reach. Never feeling satisfied with any of the things that we do because constantly there's someone in our head telling us that we're not good enough. That unfulfilling feeling, that lack of fulfillment that drives us to keep pushing more and more and more, constantly making it so we're never going to feel like it's enough. I'm here to talk about that today. That feeling and that drive, and having the humility to say that I don't need to prove myself anymore. I'm good enough as I am. I'm good enough to say whatever I say, do whatever I do, be whoever I am, and accept all of it. Whether I like it or not, I'm not going to let my perfectionism and my inadequacy and my pride overwrite the joy that I'm supposed to have in this life. Overwrite the good feelings that are supposed to be present in me just from my accomplishments and being the unique person I am. That's a hard subject to talk about because it's one I deal with a lot currently in a really bad way. I constantly feel like I have to prove myself. It never really feels like enough when, you constantly have that standard. To put a standard up on a pedestal that you can't reach with your arm on a stool, with a ladder, or even on a mountaintop. To put a standard that high up and be hard on yourself when you don't reach it. It's a common trait, but it's no less deadly no matter how many people have it. So join me today and I'll talk about it. You gotta excuse me, I have this giant robot arm in front of my face. I gotta read this Bible verse to try to correlate, stuff with things. But I want to highlight a Bible verse that I read recently from the Gospel of Luke. It's Luke chapter 9, verse 46 through 48, I believe. And I'll just read it because I think it pertains to this idea. Then his disciples began arguing about which of them was the greatest. But Jesus knew their thoughts, so he brought a little child to his side. Then he said to them, "Anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf welcomes me. And anyone who welcomes me also welcomes my Father who sent me. Whoever is the least among you is the greatest." And now that verse is, a testament to humility, I feel. Humility that allows you to not bicker and prove yourself over who's the greatest in whatever adult pursuit you have to be better. Someone who can say, all of this stuff that I see as valuable in this adult world, it is valuable, but there's a part of me that's being neglected here. It's that childlike part of ourselves. We might call it the inner child and whatever. It's a childlike person who is okay with being below, who's okay with being enough, who's okay with being someone who is not above. I think in the adult world, there is a standard that is put on us both from ourselves and society and everyone around us that we have to almost compete with one another, that we have to be someone who is good enough to conquer the world, good enough to conquer the challenges ahead of them. Because if we're not, this brutal world will stomp on us and we won't be able to get up after. And if it stomps on us hard enough and we're not resilient enough to take the blows, well, then maybe we're not cut out for this world. Maybe we're not cut out for this society that is so brutal and so vicious in how it wants to treat you. We're taught that. But, someone like a child, like Jesus says in this, a child is innocent. A child is someone who can take the world for what it is, use their lack of knowledge, use their lack of whatever you want to call it, their view that isn't fully formed on life, and just live life to the full extent that they can, at least to a point. Many of us as children, we had our life, unfortunately, damaged pretty early. We had, a lot of trauma that came. We had a lot of neglect. We had a lot of things that told us we weren't good enough and that we would have to be, quote unquote, perfect in order to get past that. We would have to be cutthroat and vicious, we would have to be like a predatory animal just going and stalking its prey so that we can get it, take it, our prey is caught, we're hungry, we ate, we feel like we're sustained from that. That drive, that fire that drives us in the adult world is rooted in this sort of selfishness in a way. Not to be derogatory about it, but it's rooted in this sort of self-sustaining cycle. Humility is about the opposite of that. Humility is something that makes it so we can feel like, I don't know, feel like things are a little bit more okay when they're not up to some prideful standard or some selfishness. But the point is that I'm trying to make is that in my life, I've constantly tried to suppress the quote-unquote less desirable parts of myself, the things that are not up to the adult standard I need to reach in this world. I've neglected that inner child in the past because I didn't feel like he was fit for this world. And from that, I had to develop this sort of ambition, to try to become this, I guess, suitable person, someone who is up to the standard of life, so that everyone around me would see me as that respectable young adult who was strong enough to go out on his own. And in that, I left a child who had no choice in the matter behind. I left that child who was okay with just being a fun, quirky, humble kid. I left him in the dust because I felt like that kid wouldn't function in this world. And I think, honestly, with that came this dissatisfaction, this lack of humility, this lack of fulfillment that led to a perfectionism that still dominates my life, like so many other people. And I mean, I asked myself, how could I ever be okay with being whatever I am if perfectionism is my sole driver? The thing that drives the bus down to the school where I got to prove myself as smart enough or wise enough or strong enough or whatever in front of all my peers and students that say, you got to be like this, you got to be like that. It's just like we've always had to go through in school or something like that, We feel surrounded by people who have a standard of their own, and we try to live up to that standard because, whether directly or indirectly, they tell us to. It's not a fun way to live. And then when we try to reach that standard and we fall short, whether it's in our eyes or theirs or both, we start to get frustrated. We start to get disappointed. Sometimes we even get hateful, We feel mad that they would ever disapprove of what we do. We've worked so hard to get here. Why is that person not allowing me to feel good about myself? Why are they disapproving of me? Why aren't they giving me the same recognition and love that I hope to get from this entire pursuit of being the person I've tried to be for so long? Those are questions that are hard to answer because they're all rooted in a self-perception, a perception that says we're not good enough until we've proved ourselves to others. And you can see how exhausting that can get. Because each person is different. Each view is different. Each day is different. Each time we go and try to prove ourselves, it's a different person we're talking to based on whatever day it is. One person might be in a bad mood. They might be in a good mood. We don't read into that. We do something that we hope impresses them. They don't respond to it. Why? Why are they not responding to it? They must hate me. They must not think I'm impressive. They must think I'm stupid. I feel embarrassed. I feel like a class clown. I feel like a court jester, And you can see how that dialogue, or rather that monologue in your head, that inner monologue gets so tiring and intoxicating. Because that dialogue, that monologue, whatever, it's all of it. It seems to be the fuel for the fire. Now, look at like a Michael Jordan type person. If you know anything about, that mindset, there is this constant sort of dissatisfaction with losing, with, falling short of a standard. And from that, in my own personal experience with that sort of thing, I found a sort of monologue that I tell myself, an inner monologue that says the only way to get better is to constantly put your standard above what's reasonable and try to reach it. And even if you fall short of that standard, you'll still obtain the same amount of skill that you needed in order to topple over all your foes and enemies, And while, for the base efficiency of like winning, that's good. For the emotional part of your life, the psyche, the brain, the heart, all that stuff starts to just melt. You're melting into one thing, and that's just this lion heart that is trying to constantly take down all of its prey as quickly as possible because it's hungry. That hunger, it's never quenched. It's never satisfied. You're constantly hungry. You're not satisfied with pizza or burgers. You're satisfied with victory. That is a deadly chase that many of us have gone on, and it's never easy. Whether it's victory or whether it's just constant approval, validation, admiration, anything, attention. We've been there, whether we noticed it or not. There's a small scale journey that I think I've gone on in my life of trying to get constant, we'll call it attention. It's more admiration than anything. for example, when I walk into the gym, I work out pretty frequently. So when I walk into the gym, I'll come in and I'm immediately checking around. See who's looking at Austin Etchells today. Who is looking at the big gorilla? Who is looking at the big dog of the gym, the king? I am the king because this is my domain. I own this kingdom. And immediately I'm like, dude, what are you doing? Dude, stop. Because the problem is I'm already setting myself up for disappointment. Dude, I never know what I'm walking into. I never know if I'm walking into nothing or if I'm walking into something. I never know if I'm walking into a bunch of people who are my friends or a bunch of people who are strangers. So if I go in with a standard, and by the way, obviously the admiration, that I'm so desperate for it is enough of an issue, but I'm not focusing on that. The issue of constantly just looking immediately for admiration in every aspect of my life, or looking for attention in every aspect of my life, trying to fit a standard, trying to get approval for, the stuff I do from people in my life, that's exhausting. And if you put that standard on yourself immediately, you'll work to it. And so I'll try to get myself a pump or get myself looking a certain way so that I draw attention. And it's just very frustrating and it's very embarrassing. It's pretty low stuff, but it's not, of course, something to be like unbelievably ashamed about. It's a drive. The problem that's scary, the part that's bad, is the disappointment, because you're never going to be able to feel like it's enough. And I know that. I know that from my experience trying to chase the high of approval and attention, you eventually crash. And the withdrawals are bad. It's worse than any sweats and, throwing up. It's not, but it's bad. It's very bad. And I think honestly, if I was to try to correlate this to anything, it would be the constant fix that you need to get. The constant drive to escape that feeling of inadequacy that you might find in any substance. That feeling of emptiness. You all of a sudden feel like when you're a perfectionist, the only thing that makes life worth living, if you're really in the bad parts of it, is getting that victory, getting that admiration, getting that attention, affection, nurturing, all that stuff. Getting that stamp of approval from people that you are good enough because they said it, not you. They said it. That is a high when you get it. It truly is, because you have so little feelings, such a low amount of self-worth in yourself, from your own view, independent of others, that a burst of self-worth from others is like the greatest thrill in the world. And you'll constantly chase that. That's where perfectionism stems from for me. I feel as if I can, just prove myself over and over and over again, I'm in a constant cycle, a constant loop of self-satisfaction through the approval of others. But it's not that. It's not that. It's not at all that. It's not a cycle. It's a constant, bumpy road that sometimes stops and sometimes goes. I never get it in the way I want it to. When it comes, it's random. When it doesn't, it's random. And in that, I'm constantly confused, scared, paranoid that I'm not going to be able to feel fulfilled for the day, because my sole source of fulfillment comes from others. And they can't always be what I want them to be. So, what would help that? What would help that sort of thing, Feeling like you can't ever be fulfilled because of that big old standard, hanging over your head, looming over your head, judging you, telling you that you can't be good enough because it doesn't say you're good enough, and it never will. It never will. What can stop that? Well, that's a tough question. If I had the answer, I probably wouldn't be making this episode, at least not like it is. But I think for me, it is rooted in that humility. And if you want to take it from a Christian approach, you can. If you want to take it from a solely mental health approach, you can. For example, mental health, an act of humility would be, for example, a DBT skill that I learned called radical acceptance. That is just a process of accepting the current reality for what it is and finding mechanisms to do that. Now, if you want to look up the skill, you can. But basically what I do for it is radical acceptance for me allows for that acceptance of the reality that I'm in for the moment, so I can have some clarity to go and figure this out, to go focus on this sort of weird drive I have, this urge to escape the pain of inadequacy, whatever inadequacy is to me at that moment. But from a Christian perspective, praying on it and asking for humility from God is such an important thing, because there's this sort of pride that pops up, I feel, when we achieve something or accomplish something or do prove ourselves for a moment. But that pride never lasts, That pride always fades because we don't have that healthy pride, if you want to call it that, I don't know, gratification in our own worth. And so when we don't get the thing that we're constantly looking for, let's say, going back, if people can't always give us the thing we want consistently, we'll start to fall. We'll fall flat of our standard and pain starts. And that's when we can start chasing it even harder. And I think it's difficult without some sort of acceptance from God or from, your skills you use. For me, I personally believe God is the best source of acceptance, but that's just me. I feel as if that's the case because, no one in this world, and I talked about it in my first video, no one in this world, ourselves or others, can give us that acceptance in a way that's true and absolute and cannot be contorted through just some judgment or some sort of behavior of another person or ourselves. With God, there's always that acceptance. There's always that sort of thing that is there, that spirit that tells us that we can be accepted as long as we stay true to who we are in a virtuous, righteous way and work to worship and praise as much as we can. If we do that, fundamentally, we can work closer and closer to being up to that standard. And that standard is not that perfect standard of being sinless. It's not, supposed to be reached. And from that, we can take solace in that reality that says we can never be perfect. For me, that's become a lot easier with Christianity. But for the non-Christian, it's tough, It's really tough. Because acceptance either comes from within or outside of ourselves, or both. That seems to be what it is, It doesn't have an otherworldly application. So how do you find that within yourself? Because I think it's important to find both. Well, acceptance from ourselves comes with a humility regardless of our religious beliefs. It comes from a willingness to admit that we don't have to be what they told us to be all those years ago. We don't have to fit into some Slytherin standard, some weird serpent-like, society that tells us to be brutal and cutthroat and crush our enemies. But that would mean that we have to not be perfect, that we would have to not be up to that standard we've been working to be for so long. And yeah, it's tough. It's a really tough thing to do. It's a reality that you have to accept at some point. And it's also a chase that you have to stop going after. You might have to look at your prey and say, I'm not hungry anymore. That is really tough. And I'm still working at it. And from the little amount I've experienced it, as unsatisfying as this advice can be sometimes because it's such a long process, I notice a little bit of clarity and leeway in that drive. And that comes from an acceptance of my faults, of my innocent child within. The child that is good enough because he's just him. And he works to be good. He works to be nice to people. He works to be assertive. He works to set boundaries. He works to do all that stuff. He doesn't have to be a god amongst men. He doesn't have to be a king amongst peasants. Because he was never that. And he won't be. But what he was a kid who had a lot of fun. A kid who was humble enough to let others in at times. And a kid who needs a lot of work. A kid who is going to get things done and be better. That takes a lot of humility. And takes a lot of fearlessness, to release that drive to be the best or to be perfect. Because it's almost like, excuse my language, it's almost like blue balling yourself, It's like giving you just this sort of cutoff. You cut yourself off from whatever you're chasing after all these years. But that takes so much strength. And it shows you really have grown. It shows you've grown. It shows I've grown if I've been able to do this. If I can finally get to the point where I've said, I don't need to see any more from myself, but I'm going to keep pushing because I want to do it for me, that shows all that work I put in was worth it. Even if I didn't get to the result I wanted to. That road was still traveled and it led to a destination. Just wasn't the one I thought it would. And I think that's a big thing. So if you resonate with this at all, keep in mind that it takes a lot to relinquish that drive to be better. It takes a lot, but it is a testament to your strength when you do. You are stronger. You are better. You are someone who can be proud of themselves even more so when you allow yourself to say, I don't need to prove myself to anyone anymore. And that's all for today. See ya!